Good afternoon, guys. Today's video I'm going to go through how I make compost in my sort of small-ish growing space. So a little disclaimer before we start this video is that becoming completely self-sufficient in compost is quite a big task. You need a lot of material to do that. But what I'm doing in this video is making sure that I can supplement my compost usage, making it a little bit more cost effective, but also hopefully improving the sort of quality of what I'm growing here in the garden. So the reason I make my own compost, the first reason is I think I get better quality compost by making my own. The big thing that I found out recently, and it's sort of changed my perception of this, is that compost you buy varies in quality. You can spend more money and you get a higher quality compost, or you can go quite cheap and you get a low quality compost. I had never really noticed a difference until I bought one particular bag of compost, which is very woody, and I grew some seedlings in it. I think at the time it was pumpkins and sweet corn, and unfortunately there wasn't very many nutrients in the compost. The leaves went yellow and the seedlings didn't do very well. The big problem with that is something like pumpkins and sweet corn, you're pretty much aiming to sow them in sort of April, May time, and if you miss that opportunity, or if your seedlings fail and you've got to sow again, there isn't always that much time. So I think it is quite important, compost, and making sure you've got good quality, which is what hopefully I've got here. Now, the other reason I make my own compost is it's a circular system. It's much more economic. So rather than loading up my green waste bin or my green sort of council waste bin, I can keep the nutrients here in the garden. I'm not shipping them elsewhere. So obviously plants pull nutrients out of the soil, and then you compost the plants. You therefore compost a lot of the nutrients and return it back into the garden. So I think that's another good reason. Not only that, but obviously avoiding plastics, avoiding sort of not necessarily air miles, but road miles associated with compost making as well, is something that we should all be considering. So in my small garden, I have 2 Dalek bins composting. I only have 2, and the reason I have 2 is because I'm not necessarily producing that much waste, that much compost material. So 2 works out fine for me. You might want 3 if you have a bigger garden. You may be able to get away with 1, but the benefit of 2 is that you can be filling one of them while the other one is kind of cooking and decomposing. What you don't necessarily want to do, and I'll come on to why it's important in a minute, is be constantly adding to the same bin. What basically, in essence, what it does is it will compact the compost, stopping there being good sort of air supply in the compost, and it'll make your compost much more wet, much more sort of anaerobic, and not necessarily as good as it could be. So what do I put in my compost bins? Well, as you can see here, it's a mixture of green material and brown material. Now, the green material, leaves like this, are high in nitrogen. These will break down and release nitrogen into the soil. Whereas brown material, like this stuff here, is high in carbon. And what you want is about a 50-50 mix. And there's lots of science around that about what is the perfect mix. But what I've found is with my 50-50 mix, I get compost that looks a little bit like this. Now, the source of your compost can vary. I've got some sort of tree clippings I can put in. I can chop them up small. And that's one thing to be mindful of, is chopping up things small as possible to increase the surface area. Now, as well as making sure that you get the contents of the compost correct, 50-50 green and browns, one thing you also want to do is about halfway through making your compost is to turn it. Now, typically on a small scale like this, compost is going to take about 12 months, maybe 9 months to make, depending on how hot it gets. If it's really hot summer and you've sited your compost bin in a really sunny location, it should break down a bit quicker. But you're looking at about 12 months. So at around about the 6-month mark, one of the things you're going to want to do is turn it. Now, I did this a few days ago, and pretty much I just moved it from one bin into the other. So with these Dalek bins, they do fairly easily lift up off of the compost, so exposing it. You can then sort of get a shovel in there, load up a wheelbarrow or something, and then maybe fill in your next compost bin. Now, the reason for doing this is twofold. One, you increase the air supply. Aerobic organisms, microorganisms, need oxygen, and the aerobic organisms are the organisms that will help the most in decomposing your compost. The second reason for turning compost is to help mix mix things. Now, what they say to do is to put your compost in layers. I don't worry too much about this. Again, I'm just aiming at that kind of 50-50 green and brown, hoping everything's going to work out. But if you do a turning about the 6 month mark, you're going to get an opportunity to mix things up and make sure everything's incorporated nicely, and that your compost is therefore a lot more sort of uniform when you come to use it. Now, I'm going to take a little look in up close of the finished product. Now, what we'll find here is that it won't necessarily look like what you buy in the shops. It's a much more crumbly in this case. It's a little bit wetter as well. But the main thing you're looking for is signs of life. Worms like this are your sort of composting worms, and they will just show up. You don't have to worry about introducing these guys. They will just turn up as your compost begins to decompose. Now, there are some big bits in here, big like sort of beech leaves, I think is what these are, or yeah, beech leaves, I think. Now, these might not necessarily be present in a bag of compost that you buy, but this is perfectly fine to be putting on your vegetable beds or on your flower beds. It will still provide nutrients, and it will continue breaking down once you've incorporated it. So definitely this here is what I would call ready to go compost. So I hope this video sort of shows that you don't necessarily need a massive load of space and a massive load of material to make good compost in your sort of small sort of garden. What I will say is that there are a few sort of elements to help make things a bit easier, but this is a very natural process, something that's very simple to do. But I think if you stick to making sure you provide about a 50-50 mix of green and browns, and that you turn your compost after about 6 months of it being sort of finished filling, you should be on to some really good compost. And if you've got any questions, do put them down in the comments. I'm more than happy to sort of talk about my process and things that haven't gone that well and things that have. And yeah, I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. And if you do, don't forget to like and subscribe.